The sun had already baked the land flat and brittle long before Boone Harper's horse trudged across it. The sky was a lid of pale blue fire, the kind that burned the sweat off a man before it ever formed. There wasn't much left of Boone now, just weathered skin, a gray beard like sun-bleached straw, and eyes that still held too much of yesterday. He'd once been a name whispered across 3 counties, a rider with a price on his head and a 6-gun that never missed. Now he was just another shadow crossing a dying plain, riding a horse too tired to spook at rattlesnakes. Boone had been living out near Salt Mesa for near 10 years, tending a handful of stubborn cattle that didn't know when to quit. He liked the quiet there. No saloons, no gun smoke, no talk. A man could live out his days without ever hearing his name spoken wrong. That was until the letter came. It had been waiting for him at the post shack, a yellowed envelope with his old cattle brand burned into the corner. D.C. for Dry Creek. No name, no stamp, just that mark and 3 words scrawled in charcoal. Dry Creek needs you. Boone had stared at it for a long time. He hadn't heard those words in 20 years. Dry Creek was where it all ended. The gang, the killings, the oaths they never should have made. He'd buried more than one friend in that dirt. He should have burned the letter, but some ghosts don't take kindly to being ignored. He folded it into his coat pocket, saddled his mare, and left before dawn. By noon he was half a day east, passing the ridge they used to call Widow's Spine. The wind there carried sand sharp enough to cut the face. He thought of Elias, the old preacher, or what passed for one. Back in the day, Elias could shoot scripture from one hand and bullets from the other. They used to joke that the Lord couldn't decide if he wanted him in heaven or hell, so he kept him wandering in between. Boone figured if the letter had found him, it might have found Elias too. Same with the others, Reed, Cass, and Harlan. 5 men who once thought they could outshoot the law, time, and death itself. 5 fools who learned the desert always wins. He camped that night under a stand of dying pines. His fire was small, just enough to see the letter one more time. The writing was smudged, but the mark burned clear. He remembered when they'd seared that same brand onto their rifles, saying it meant loyalty. Back then it was just pride and whiskey. Now it felt like an old scar reopening. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled, thin and lonely like the sound of a nail dragged across wood. Boone fed another twig to the fire and muttered, "Ain't no such thing as peace out here. Just long silences between the storms." He didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, 40 miles south, Elias Carter woke up in a church that wasn't his. The place leaned sideways, half buried in sand, the steeple gone. He'd been sleeping there for weeks, living off cold beans and old whiskey. He'd stopped preaching long ago, though he still talked to the Lord sometimes, not out of faith, but out of habit. When the rider came by, dusty and wordless, and left a folded paper at his door, Elias almost didn't bother to open it, but when he saw the brand burned into the corner, he laughed. A dry, bitter laugh that turned into coughing. "Dry Creek needs me," he said aloud. "Hell, son, Dry Creek buried me years ago." Still, he packed up his Bible, his gun, and the small wooden cross he carried for no one in particular. There wasn't much left for him to lose, and he'd always believed a man should finish what he started, even if it killed him. In the hills beyond Rattler Canyon, Reed McKenna was teaching a ranch boy how to aim. His hands trembled when he drew the revolver, but his eyes were still steady. The boy laughed when Reed missed a tin can 3 times in a row. Reed just smiled. "Don't matter if your hand shakes," he said. "What matters is you still pull the trigger." That's when the ranch foreman came riding up with a letter. Reed didn't need to open it to know what it was. The desert had a way of calling its own back. He told the boy to keep the gun. "You'll need it when men come for what's yours," he said, mounting his horse. The boy asked where he was going. Reed only answered, "Home, if you can call a graveyard home." Cass Monroe was sitting at a poker table in El Paso when his letter found him. He'd just won a pot of silver dollars, but it didn't make him smile. He was the kind of man who never celebrated his luck, because luck was a debt that always came collecting. The envelope arrived by a hand he didn't recognize. Cass turned it over, saw the brand, and felt the weight of years crash down like thunder. He folded his cards, pushed his winnings across the table, and stood up. "Game's over, boys," he said. "Old ghosts want a rematch," the bartender called after him. "Where you headed, Cass?" Cass stopped at the door and grinned without humor. "Dry Creek, where the sun never sets and the dead don't rest." Last of them was Harlan Boyd, former sheriff of a town that didn't exist anymore. He'd buried his badge the day the railroad came through and turned law into business. Now he spent his days fixing fences for men half his age. When the letter arrived, he didn't speak a word, just stared at it, jaw tightening. He saddled his horse, strapped his old rifle across his back, and looked once more at the empty hills. He said nothing, but in his eyes burned the same thing that lived in all 5 of them. The knowledge that the West had moved on. But they hadn't. 3 days later, Boone reached the edge of Dry Creek Valley. The land was unrecognizable. What had once been a living town, a saloon, a general store, the stables where they'd tied their horses, was now nothing but splintered beams and silence. The old water tower leaned like a dying man. Only the wind moved. Boone dismounted, brushed the dust from his hat, and stood there a long time. Then he knelt, took out his knife, and carved the old brand into the side of a rotted post to DC, the last sign that Dry Creek had ever lived. He heard a horse approaching behind him. Didn't turn around. Didn't have to. The voice said, "Took you long enough, Boone." Boone smiled faintly. "Elias thought you'd be dead by now." "Maybe I am," Elias said, dismounting. "But looks like the desert forgot to tell me." They stood there together, 2 old men under a sky that had seen it all. Somewhere far out, dust clouds rose. 4 more riders, maybe less, maybe ghosts. Boone squinted into the sun and whispered, "Looks like the past ain't done with us yet." The wind answered him with silence, and somewhere in that silence, Dry Creek breathed again. The desert stretched wide and empty, like God had scraped the world clean and left nothing but dust to remember it by. Boone Harper and Elias Carter rode side by side for half a day without saying much. Words had weight out there, and both men had carried too much already. They stopped at a dry creek bed, the same one that once gave the town its name. Now it was nothing but cracked clay and ghost grass. Boone knelt, brushed the dirt, and muttered, "Used to be water so clear you could see your horse's reflection." Elias spat into the dust. "World's been drying up since we left it. They camped under a dead cottonwood tree that night." Boone's horse twitched at the sound of coyotes somewhere beyond the ridge. The wind carried the smell of smoke. Old wood, maybe a fire from the town that wasn't there anymore. Elias sat with his Bible open on his knees, though his eyes didn't move across the words. "You ever wonder?" Boone said, staring into the flames. "If we could have done it different?" Elias chuckled low. "Every night for 20 years. And every night I figure it wouldn't have mattered. We were built for the kind of trouble that don't wash off." Boone poked at the fire with a stick. "Reed, Cass, Harlan, you think they'll come?" "They will," Elias said, closing the Bible. "Men like us don't die until the desert says so." 3 ridges west, Reed McKenna was fighting the wind. The sand whipped across his face like 1,000 stinging needles, and his horse was near spent. He pulled up at an old telegraph post and tied off his reins. From the saddlebag he took out the letter, now tattered, edges flaking to powder. "Dry Creek needs you." The words looked older than he felt. He chuckled, though it came out like a cough. "Hell, I'm half dead already." He thought of the others. Boone with his cold eyes, Elias and his cursed prayers, Cass the gambler, Harlan the lawman who'd lost his town. They weren't good men, not by a long shot, but they'd once been brothers, the kind that bled and buried together. That counted for something. He looked toward the horizon, saw faint shapes moving, mirages maybe, or just ghosts of memory. Once Dry Creek had been their kingdom. They rode for no man, answered to no badge. But every kingdom falls, and theirs fell in gunfire and smoke. As the sun went down, Reed spoke softly to the wind. "I'll ride till I drop, boys. Ain't no quittin' me yet." He mounted up and rode into the bleeding red dusk, the desert swallowing his tracks as if to erase him from history. In a gambling hall 2 towns over, Cass Monroe was buying silence with whiskey. He sat alone at the end of the bar, turning his empty glass over and over. A drunk beside him mumbled something about the railroad men paying good for hired guns. Cass didn't even look up. "I've seen their kind," he said. "Men who sell the land for coin don't understand what it costs to build it." The drunk blinked at him. "You some kind of rancher?" Cass smiled without humor. "Once. Now I'm just what's left when the ranch burns." He tossed a few silver dollars on the counter and stepped outside. The sky was wide open, stars scattered like bullet holes. He lit a cigarette and leaned against the hitching post. His horse, old and gray, looked as tired as he felt. Cass thought of Boone, his old friend, his old rival. Thought of that day long ago when blood ran through Dry Creek's main street. They'd buried 4 men before sundown and swore they'd never come back. But promises are thin things in a man's twilight years. He ground the cigarette into the dirt, mounted up, and whispered, "Let's go home, girl. One more ride." The horse groaned, then started forward. Behind them, the town lights flickered out one by one. North of the canyon, Harlan Boyd rode slow but steady. He wasn't chasing time. He was keeping pace with it. The rifle strapped across his back was older than most men still living, and the badge in his coat pocket was tarnished nearly black. He passed a sign half buried in sand. Dry Creek, 12 miles. The sight made his jaw tighten. He'd once sworn he'd never ride that road again. Too many ghosts waited down it, but the land had a way of calling you back to finish what you left undone. He dismounted at a small rise where you could see the valley below. The wind shifted, carrying faint echoes, a hammer striking metal, a horse snorting, maybe a gunshot far off. Or maybe just memories. He pulled out the badge, wiped it on his sleeve, and pinned it to his chest again. The weight felt strange, heavier than it used to. He spoke under his breath, voice cracking like old leather. "If they're taking Dry Creek, they'll do it over my bones." Then he mounted again and rode on, the moonlight catching the old star on his chest. 2 days later, as the wind howled through the empty canyons, the 5 men finally saw each other for the first time in 20 years. Boone and Elias were camped near the ridge when Reed appeared out of the haze, horse limping, hat caked in dust. Boone stood, grinning faintly. "Thought you'd died out here, old man." Reed laughed. "Tried to. Desert wouldn't have me." Cass rode in next. A shadow among shadows. Then Harlan last and still upright, still wearing that badge. They sat around the fire that night, 5 ghosts of the old world, listening to the crackle of flame and the far-off hum of wind through dead grass. For a long while, no one spoke. Finally, Elias said, "Feels like the world's forgotten us." Boone replied, "World's forgotten a lot of things. Dry Creek just happens to be one of them." Harlan looked up, face cut deep with lines. "Not for long. Railroad men are coming. I seen 'em, setting camp near Dust Hollow. Gonna lay track straight through the valley." Boone's eyes hardened. "Through the graves, too?" Harlan nodded once. Didn't seem to care whose bones they crushed. The fire popped. Cass flicked the ashes off his cigarette. "Then we give 'em reason to care." Reed smiled slow. "You mean to fight 'em? 5 old men against an army of hired guns?" Boone said, "Not for gold, not for glory. Just for the land that remembers us when no one else does." Elias muttered, "Desert never forgets." Boone, "Only men do." The flames threw their shadows against the rocks, 5 dark shapes flickering like spirits reborn. Above them, the stars burned cold and sharp, and the wind whispered through the canyon like a hymn for the dead. When morning came, they saddled their horses and rode out together for the first time in decades, slow, proud, and silent. Behind them, their campfire smoldered to ash, and the desert swallowed their tracks once more. The horizon waited ahead, vast, endless and cruel, and somewhere beyond it lay Dry Creek, a ghost town holding the last story the West had to tell. The wind sang low that morning, a sound like dry bones rolling across stone. The 5 men rode side by side down the old road to Dry Creek. The town came into view slow, like a ghost appearing through heat shimmer. Broken boards, a few leaning, posts, the skeleton of the saloon where they'd once drunk whiskey that burned like fire and laughed like they were gods. No laughter now, no sound but hooves and wind. Boone reined in first, his eyes narrowing. "Ain't much left." Cass muttered, "Looks about how we left it, shot to pieces." Harlan dismounted, dust swirling around his boots. "Still home," he said. They tied their horses outside what was left of the general store. Inside, the floor creaked like an old memory. Boone brushed dust off the counter, finding the initials they'd carved into the wood years ago. BH, EC, RM, CM, H. B, still faintly visible. Elias let out a small laugh, rough and tired. "We were boys then. Thought the world couldn't touch us." Reed leaned on the doorframe. "And now we're ghosts it already forgot." Boone turned to them. "World's got new rules now. Railroad's coming through. Tracks'll cut right across this town through the graves in the creek bed. If we're still breathing, we don't let that happen. Cass lit a cigarette. And if we ain't? Then the land'll remember who stood for it, Boone said. They spent the next 2 days fixing what could be fixed. Not much, but enough to matter. Boone repaired the saloon doors with a hammer and stubbornness. Reed cleaned the rifles and laid them out across a table like old friends returning home. Harlan set up watch from the church steeple, what was left of it anyway. Elias found his way to the old cemetery beyond town. He knelt by a row of sunken crosses and whispered names no one else would remember. He planted a new one. Rough wood, no name, just a carved brand, D.C. That night they gathered by a campfire outside the saloon. The desert glowed under a half-moon. Coyotes called from far off, and the wind rustled through the old fences like an echo of applause for something long dead. Boone broke the silence first. You all know what's coming. Harlan nodded. Railroad men. Hired guns with new iron, new rules. They'll be here by week's end. Reed poured whiskey into 5 tin cups. Then we make a pact. Elias raised his head. What kind of pact? Boone looked around the fire. Same as before. We stand together till the end. Ain't about winning. It's about leaving something behind that won't rot in the sun. Cass smirked. You mean a legend? No, Boone said. A promise kept. They drank in silence, each staring into the flames like it could tell their future. The whiskey burned down hard, same as truth. Before dawn, Boone walked alone to the ridge overlooking the valley. The stars were fading, and far out, faint lights glimmered. Camps, torches, and smoke. The railroad men were closer than they'd thought. He could almost hear the clang of metal, the hammer striking steel. Elias joined him, silent at first. Then, You think this is worth dying for, Boone? Boone didn't turn. I ain't dying for land. I'm dying for what it meant, for who we were when it was ours. Elias nodded slowly. Then I'll preach for you if I still remember how. The next day they got to work. Reed oiled the rifles and loaded ammunition from crates left to rot decades ago. Cass scouted the canyon trails leading into the valley, noting the choke points and high rocks. Harlan cleaned his badge, pinning it over his heart. It didn't shine anymore, but it still meant something. Boone gathered them by noon, spread a map over an old barrel. They'll come through Dust Hollow, he said, pointing with his knife. Narrow pass, good for a stand. We set traps here and here. Elias, you take the ridge with Reed. Cass, you cover the rear trail. Harlan and I'll hold the line. Cass gave a crooked smile. Just like old times. Reed grunted. Except this time, ain't no reward waiting. Boone said, maybe not in gold, but when the wind blows through this valley, maybe it'll still carry our names. That night the storm rolled in. Not rain, but dust and thunder. The air was thick, the sky bruised purple. They huddled in the saloon, oil lamps flickering against cracked mirrors. Elias read from his Bible, though his voice was hoarse. The valley of dry bones, and the bones came together, bone to his bone. Reed chuckled. Sounds about right. Boone took out the letter that started it all, laid it in the fire. The paper curled and blackened, the mark burning bright before it vanished. Dry Creek don't need letters, he said quietly. It's got us. Before sleep, Harlan stood outside, watching the desert breathe under lightning. He could see the outline of the coming fight written in the dark, shapes of riders, glints of guns. The young ones were coming, and they'd think it would be easy. He touched the badge over his chest and whispered, They'll learn. Morning came red and cruel. The storm had passed, leaving the land clean as bone. The 5 men stood on the ridge above the hollow, rifles strapped, eyes sharp. Below, the dust clouds of riders approached. 20 maybe more. Boone squinted through his scope. They brought numbers. Reed loaded a round. So did the Alamo. Cass grinned. And look how that turned out. Elias crossed himself. Boys, this is as close to church as we're getting. Harlan raised his rifle. Then let's make it a good sermon. They waited in silence until the first rider appeared in range. The man wore a clean coat, shiny boots, and a smugness that didn't belong in the desert. He lifted a megaphone and called out, "This land's government property now, you old-timers best move on." Boone's voice came steady. "We ain't the moving kind." The man laughed. "You think you can stop progress?" Boone answered with the sharp crack of his rifle. The man tumbled from his horse, the desert swallowing his echo. The gunfight began. By sundown, the sky was a bleeding red, the air thick with smoke and grit. Bodies lay scattered through the canyon. The 5 men still stood, hurt, spent, but unbroken. Boone wiped blood from his brow. We held it. Elias leaned against a rock, breathing heavy. For now. Reed reloaded with trembling hands. Ain't over till the dark takes us. Cass glanced at the valley below. The sun sinking behind the ridge, painting the graves in gold. Then we best make peace with the dark. Boone looked at each of them one by one and nodded. We keep our word. Dry Creek stands. The desert wind rose, whispering around them like applause, like memory, like ghosts gathering close. And when the night came, it came quiet, not in defeat, but in the kind of silence only the desert knows how to keep. The desert stretched out like an ocean of dying fire, miles upon miles of cracked earth glowing under a blood-orange sun. The 5 old cowboys rode slow, each horse dragging its shadow like a ghost behind it. The heat shimmered off the horizon, blurring rock and sky together until everything looked like a half-remembered dream. There was no sound but the wind whispering through sagebrush and the faint creak of saddles. For hours nobody spoke. Words seemed too heavy for this kind of silence, the kind that came after a gunfight or a death or a lifetime of regrets. Boone led the group, his gray mustache twitching every time he scanned the dunes. Behind him rode Jesse, his broad shoulders sunburnt, his eyes hidden behind dust-streaked glasses. Then came Red, chewing a stick of tobacco as if it were the last comfort left in the world. Beside him rode Micah, always fiddling with that broken pocket watch he'd carried since his wife's passing, though no one dared mention her. And last was old Clay, riding slower than the rest, his hat tipped low, mumbling half-prayers to no one in particular. The desert does strange things to a man's mind. Somewhere between the heat and the silence, memories begin to rise like mirages. Boone saw the faces of men he'd buried, outlaws, friends, and 1 or 2 he wished he hadn't had to kill. He remembered the first time he drew his gun in anger, the smell of powder, the look in that young man's eyes before he fell. Some nights he still woke up hearing that single shot echoing through his dreams. "Boone," Jesse's voice cracked through the still air. "You sure we're headed right? Feels like we've been riding in circles." Boone lifted his canteen, took a long swallow of warm water, and handed it back. "Ain't no circle," he said. "Just the same damn view every way you look." Red let out a dry laugh. "Hell, maybe we're ghosts already, right in the afterlife and too stubborn to notice." Micah looked up from his saddle. "If this is heaven, they sure skimped on the water and whiskey." The men chuckled low, the kind of laugh that carried a hint of sorrow underneath. Then silence again. As dusk began to creep over the ridges, they came upon an old trading post half swallowed by sand. The roof sagged, the sign had long fallen, and the windows were black holes filled with shadow. Boone dismounted first, his boots crunching over the dry earth. He pushed open the door. It gave a slow, creaking groan like a coffin lid. Inside, the air was thick with dust and memory. Empty bottles lined the shelves. Bullet holes pocked the counter. A playing card, the ace of spades, lay on the floor, half buried in sand. "Looks like home," Red muttered, brushing cobwebs from an old stool before sitting. Boone knelt beside the counter and ran his hand along a deep gouge in the wood. "I've been here before," he said quietly. "Long time ago. This place, this was Jenkins' store." Clay looked up. "Jenkins? The one you—" Boone didn't let him finish. "Yeah, him." No one spoke after that. They all knew what Boone meant. There were stories buried under that man's silence, stories of revenge, betrayal, and the kind of killing a man never forgets. They built a small fire outside the post as night fell. Coyotes howled in the distance, and the stars burned bright and sharp overhead. The flames flickered over their faces, turning them into bronze masks of the past, men who had seen too much, done too much, and yet still clung to life like it owed them something. Red leaned back against a log, staring into the fire. You boys ever think maybe we weren't meant to make it this far? Like the world done passed us by and we're just riding the edge till it kicks us off? Micah poked at the embers. I've been thinking that since Dodge City dried up. Ain't no lawmen, ain't no outlaws no more. Just fences, railroads, and folks too busy to look you in the eye. Jesse sighed. Maybe that's the way it's supposed to be. We had our time. Ain't no shame in that. Boone gazed out toward the horizon where the faint outline of mountains rose against the starlit sky. Maybe, he said. But there's one more thing needs settling before we fade. The others knew what he meant. The outlaw gang, McGraw's men, were still out there heading for the same gold shipment the Cowboys were after. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about honor, about finishing what they started. Tomorrow, Boone said, standing. We ride before dawn. By sundown this ends, they nodded one by one. Even Clay, who rarely spoke, gave a slow, firm grunt of agreement. As the fire died to embers, each man lay back against his saddle, staring at the stars. The desert wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the ghosts of 100 old gunfights and broken dreams. Boone couldn't sleep. He sat up, watching the horizon, thinking about all the faces he'd known. Some were friends, some enemies, all gone now. The West was dying, same as them. The railroads had tamed the wild land, and cities were sprouting where open plains once stretched free. He wondered if someday someone would tell stories about them. 5 old cowboys who rode one last time into the heart of the desert, chasing justice that no longer mattered. He smiled faintly. Hell, he whispered. Maybe that's enough. The wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of a harmonica, maybe Micah playing, or maybe just the desert remembering the song of men who refused to die quietly. And in that haunting music, Boone felt something like peace, a brief moment of stillness before the storm that would come with the sunrise. Dawn crept slow and red over the desert. The first rays of light brushed the horizon, painting the world in shades of fire and dust. The 5 old cowboys were already saddled, their silhouettes cut against the pale glow, tired men but still proud. Still standing tall in the saddle, Boone tightened the strap on his worn leather gloves and glanced toward the mountains. Somewhere out there, McGraw's gang was riding for the gold transport, a last big haul before disappearing into Mexico. Boone's jaw tightened. This ain't about gold no more, he muttered. It's about finishing the story right. They rode in silence. Hooves thudded against the hardpan, echoing across the open plain. The morning air was cold, sharp enough to sting their lungs, but it carried the scent of sage and the memory of gunsmoke. Each man knew deep down this might be the last ride they'd ever take. Red broke the silence first. Boone, he said softly, you think any of us will be remembered? Boone didn't look back. Don't reckon it matters, he said. All a man can ask for is to die with his boots on and no lies left behind. By mid-morning, they reached the ridge overlooking a narrow canyon. Below them, McGraw's gang and a half-dozen riders waited by the gold wagon, loading crates under the watch of 2 armed guards. McGraw himself stood tall among them, broad-shouldered, his black hat low over his eyes. Boone's eyes narrowed. That's him. Micah raised his rifle, sighted the distance. They're too many. Always are, Boone replied. But that never stopped us before. The old cowboys took their positions, Boone and Jesse down the center trail, Red and Micah flanking left, Clay on the right with the long rifle. Boone drew his revolver, spinning the cylinder once, the sound clicking like the ticking of fate. Boys, he said, voice low, let's finish this right. Then they charged. The thunder of hooves split the morning stillness. Dust exploded beneath them. Gunfire cracked through the canyon, sharp and savage. Boone's revolver roared, dropping one of McGraw's men clean off his horse. Red whooped like a madman, his rifle barking flame. Micah took a bullet to the arm but kept firing, his jaw clenched tight. Clay, high on the ridge, laid down covering shots, each one true, each one deadly. Jesse rode beside Boone, reloading with lightning hands, shouting, Left side, Boone, 2 coming in. Boone wheeled his horse, fired twice, and watched both men fall. But the fight wasn't over. McGraw himself came charging out, firing both pistols, his coat flapping like the wings of a black crow. The 2 men met in the center of the canyon, horses colliding, guns blazing. Boone's first shot tore through McGraw's hat. McGraw's return fire grazed Boone's shoulder. They hit the ground rolling, sand and blood mixing beneath their boots. "You should have stayed dead, Boone," McGraw growled, leveling his pistol. Boone spat blood. "Ain't dead yet." He lunged forward, knocking the gun aside, and the two men grappled in the dirt, old bones straining with the last of their strength. Boone's revolver clattered away, but his knife found its mark, a clean thrust under McGraw's ribs. McGraw gasped, eyes wide, and fell back into the dust. When the gunfire finally died, the canyon was quiet except for the wind. The gold wagon sat still. Smoke drifted through the air. Red limped over, his face streaked with blood and dust. Micah sat nearby, clutching his wounded arm, while Clay climbed down from the ridge, rifle slung over his shoulder. Jesse was kneeling beside a fallen horse, breathing hard. Boone stood over McGraw's body for a long time. The fight was done. The gold didn't matter. None of it did. "Let's leave it," he said finally. "Let the dead keep what's theirs." They rode out slow, silent, the rising sun casting long shadows behind them. Each man carried his own pain, wounds, scars, and memories that would never heal. By dusk, they reached the edge of the desert. A river ran ahead, shimmering in the dying light. Boone dismounted, letting his horse drink. He stared at the water, clear and cold, and saw his reflection, a weathered face carved by time and regret. Red came up beside him. "What now, Boone?" Boone smiled faintly. "Now we rest, maybe find a quiet town where the whiskey's cheap and nobody remembers our names." The others nodded. They knew he was right. The West was ending. The guns were going quiet. That night they made camp by the river. The stars burned bright overhead, just like they always had. Micah played a soft tune on his harmonica. Clay said a few words for the dead, rough and simple but heartfelt. Boone sat apart from the others, watching the fire. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his canteen, but his eyes were steady. He whispered to the flames, "We done good, boys. Better than most." When morning came, the others found him still sitting there, hat tipped low, revolver resting on his lap, the faintest smile on his face. Boone had gone quiet, finally at peace. They buried him under a lone mesquite tree by the river, marked with his name carved into a smooth stone. Then the four remaining cowboys rode off toward the horizon, the sun rising behind them, painting their silhouettes gold. No one ever wrote their names in history books. No statues were built, no songs sung. But in the quiet corners of the old frontier, where wind still whispers through dry grass, folks sometimes swear they can hear hooves in the distance. 5 riders moving slow, steady, eternal. And so ended the last ride of 5 old cowboys.